The plate hit the wall like a gunshot. Pieces of white ceramic scattered across the bunkhouse floor, spinning into corners, sliding beneath the long wooden table where 5 men sat frozen with forks halfway to their mouths. A streak of gravy ran down the pine boards like a wound. No one moved. No one breathed. And in the doorway, leaning against the frame with the easy posture of a man who had done this before and would do it again, stood Colt Danvers, his jaw set. His dark eyes bright with something that wasn't quite anger, wasn't quite pleasure, but lived somewhere dangerous between the two. The cook, a stout, red-faced man named Perkins who had lasted exactly 11 days, ripped his apron over his head and threw it onto the table. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold, though the Montana wind that October carried teeth. From something older. Something that crawled into a man's chest when he realized he was outmatched by a cruelty he couldn't name. "I'm done," Perkins said. His voice cracked on the second word. He didn't look at anyone as he walked out, and no one tried to stop him. Colt watched him go. Then he picked up the nearest plate, the one still intact, still steaming with roast and potatoes, and sat down in Perkins' empty chair. He ate slowly, deliberately, like a man savoring not the food but the silence he'd created around it. That was the third cook in 2 months. Heard about it the way he heard about most things on his own ranch, late, second-hand, and with the bitter aftertaste of helplessness. He was standing in the barn when Hector, his oldest hand, came through the side door with his hat in his weathered fingers, and that look he wore when the news was bad but not surprising. "Perkins is gone," Hector said quietly, "packed his truck 20 minutes ago." Closed his eyes. He pressed one hand against the stall door beside him and felt the rough grain of the wood dig into his palm, grounding him the way a man grips a rope in a current. He was 62 years old. He had run this ranch for 31 of those years, 4,000 acres of eastern Montana grassland that his father had carved from nothing and his wife had loved until the day it buried her. He had survived drought and wildfire, a collapsed cattle market, and a winter in '09 that froze the creek solid for 6 weeks. He had survived death, though some mornings he wasn't sure that was the right word. But he was not sure he could survive the slow bleeding out of everything he'd built, because one man made it impossible for anyone to stay. "I'll put another ad up," muttered. Hector said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The ad went up at Dawson's Feed and Supply the next morning, written in careful, slanting hand on a piece of torn cardboard, "Cook needed. Room and board included, must handle rough company." He stood there for a moment after pinning it to the corkboard, reading it back and almost laughed at the understatement. Rough company. That was like calling a rattlesnake an inconvenience. He didn't expect an answer, not a real one. The town of Alder Creek had a long memory and a short supply of people willing to walk into what everyone quietly understood was a war zone disguised as a kitchen. Colt Danvers had made sure of that. The young hands wouldn't work the ranch anymore. The old ones stayed out of loyalty to and a bone-deep stubbornness that predated common sense. But loyalty didn't fill bellies and stubbornness couldn't fry an egg. 6 days passed. The men ate canned beans and bread so stale it could chip a tooth. The youngest of the remaining crew at 44 burned a pot of rice so badly they had to leave the bunkhouse windows open overnight. Colt naturally said nothing about the food. He didn't need to. His silence after driving someone away was always louder than the destruction that preceded it. On the 7th morning, a car pulled up the dirt road to the ranch. It was a sedan, dusty blue, sun-faded, with a crack running the length of the windshield like a river on a map. It rolled to a stop near the main house, and for a long moment nothing happened. The engine ticked as it cooled. Dust settled around the tires. Then the driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. She was not what expected, though he couldn't have said what he'd expected in the first place. She was young, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair pulled back and a face that carried the kind of stillness you see in people who have learned the hard way that expression is a luxury. She wore no jewelry. Her boots were worn but clean. Her hands, when she extended one to shake his, were calloused in a way that told him she had spent years gripping things tightly. Pans, maybe, or perhaps something less voluntary. She said, her voice was low, steady, unremarkable, the voice of someone who had practiced making herself small enough to pass through rooms unnoticed. "I'm here about the cook position." Studied her, he had a rancher's instinct for reading living things, the way a heifer stood when she was sick, the way a horse shifted weight when it was about to bolt. This woman was neither sick nor skittish. She was something else entirely. She was braced. The way a person braces when they've learned that the ground beneath them can open without warning. "You have experience?" he asked. "I can feed 20 men 3 meals a day and keep a kitchen clean enough to eat off the floor," she said, no boasting in it. Just fact laid flat as a plank. "It's not the cooking that's the problem," said carefully. Glanced toward the bunkhouse. She looked at it the way someone looks at a building they've already decided to enter, measuring not whether they will but what it will cost. I saw the ad, she said. Rough company, a pause. I've had rough company before, mister. He hired her within the hour, partly because he had no choice, partly because something in the way she held herself, that practiced stillness, that refusal to perform either confidence or fear, reminded him so fiercely of that his chest tightened and he had to look away toward the mountains until it passed. Moved into the small room off the ranch kitchen that afternoon. It held a single bed, a pine dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that faced east toward a sky so wide it made the room feel like a held breath. She unpacked a single suitcase. Everything she owned fit inside it. She placed one photograph on the dresser face down and did not look at it again. By evening, she had scrubbed the kitchen until the counters gleamed, the pantry, and prepared a dinner of braised beef, roasted root vegetables, and cornbread with honey butter that filled the bunkhouse with a warmth it hadn't known in weeks. The men filed in quietly, surprised, almost reverent. Hector removed his hat, said ma'am 3 times in 2 minutes. Even the air felt different, softer, like the room remembered what it was supposed to be. And then Colt walked in. He stopped in the doorway. His gaze swept the table, the food, the woman standing near the stove with a dish towel over her shoulder. He didn't sit. He leaned against the door frame, that same posture, that same territorial stillness, and looked at the way a dog looks at a fence it hasn't yet decided whether to jump. New charity case, he said, not a question, a label. The room went rigid. Hector's fork paused, looked at his plate. Turned slowly. She met Colt's eyes, not with defiance, not with submission, but with something rarer and more unsettling, recognition. As if she had seen that exact expression before, worn by a different face, in a different life, and had already decided long ago how she would answer it. Dinner's ready, she said evenly. Sit or don't. Then she turned back to the stove. Colt stared at her back for a long, crackling moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker barely visible, like a match struck in a dark room that goes out before it catches. Then he grabbed a plate, dropped into a chair, and ate without another word. That night, after the kitchen was clean and the bunkhouse had gone dark, lay on her narrow bed and listened to the coyotes threading their voices through the cold. From somewhere distant, the bunkhouse maybe, or the barn, she caught the faint sound of a radio playing a song she almost recognized. She pressed her palm flat against her chest. Beneath her hand, her heartbeat was steady, slower than it had been in months. She whispered a name into the darkness. Not Colt's, not a smaller name, a softer one, the kind of name that belongs to someone you carried once and lost. She had come to this ranch to disappear, to fold herself into the wide silence of Montana and become no one at all. She didn't know yet that the hardest thing waiting for her wasn't the man who broke plates and drove good people away. It was the quiet truth already taking root beneath her ribs, that you cannot disappear into a place without the place finding its way into you. And this ranch, with its wounded men and endless sky, was already reaching. The first week passed like a held breath. Cooked, the men ate. Colt circled the edges of every meal like something feral testing the boundaries of a trap it couldn't quite identify. He never thanked her. He never insulted her again either, and in the grammar of that bunkhouse, silence from Colt Danvers was the closest thing to a ceasefire anyone had known. She learned them quietly, the way a woman learns a house by its creaks. Hector took his eggs dry and his coffee with 2 sugars, though he'd never admit the sweetness to anyone. Liked biscuits but was ashamed of how many he ate, so began leaving extras wrapped in cloth near the sink where he could take them without being seen. Barely ate at all, he pushed food around his plate with the absent focus of a man whose body was becoming a stranger to him, though he smiled whenever she set down the cornbread, and that smile was enough. Colt she studied from the periphery, never directly, the way you watch whether you can't control. He came to meals late or not at all. When he sat at the far end of the table with his back to the wall. He ate quickly, mechanically, like a man who had learned early that food was fuel and nothing more, that a table was not a place of warmth but a place where you kept your hands visible and your exits clear. She left a plate out for him every night, wrapped in foil, set on the counter nearest the door. She never mentioned it and he never acknowledged it. But every morning the plate was empty, the foil folded into a small, precise square and left beside the sink. That fold told her more than any words could have. Somewhere inside the chaos of him lived a strange, almost compulsive order, the ghost of a boy who had been taught to clean up after himself or face consequences. The second week, the dog appeared. Found it behind the barn at dawn, a young heeler mix, ribs showing through its dusty coat, one ear torn and crusted with dried blood. It flinched when she knelt but didn't run. She brought water in a tin bowl and sat 3 feet away, perfectly still, letting the animal decide. By the 3rd morning, the dog drank while she watched. By the 5th, it let her touch its ear. She didn't know Colt had been observing from the tack room window until the afternoon she came around the barn corner and found him crouched beside the dog, his hand hovering an inch above its head, not touching, just waiting. The dog looked up at him with the patient wariness of one damaged creature recognizing another. Colt saw and stood so fast he knocked his shoulder against the barn door. His face shuddered instantly, that hard, indifferent mask snapping into place like armor. He walked away without a word, his boots striking the packed dirt with the deliberate rhythm of a man trying to outpace something that lived inside his own chest. Said nothing. She knelt beside the dog and scratched behind its good ear and understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent years reading the body language of a dangerous man, that Colt Danvers was not what he performed. The cruelty was a costume. Beneath it was something far more frightening to him than rage. It was Nada. The third week broke everything open. It happened on a Tuesday. Colt came in late to supper, rain-soaked and raw from a 12-hour stretch mending fence line in a bitter wind. The other men had finished. The kitchen was warm, the lamps low, and was washing the last pot when Colt sat down heavily at the table. She set a full plate in front of him without ceremony: braised chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans glistening with butter. He ate in silence while she worked. The rain tapped against the windows like a visitor requesting entry. Then softly, almost involuntarily, he spoke. "My mother used to wrap plates like that." His hands paused in the water. She didn't turn. She understood instinctively that eye contact would collapse whatever fragile architecture had allowed those words to escape him. "In foil," he continued. His voice was low, scraped thin. "When my old man came home late, she'd leave a plate by the door so he wouldn't have to come looking for it, so he wouldn't wake up angry." The kitchen held its breath, the rain kept tapping. "She was smart like that," Colt said, "knew how to keep things quiet." Dried her hands slowly. She turned, leaning against the counter, and looked at him not with pity, which he would have felt like a blade, but with the steady, unshockable gaze of someone who recognized the landscape he was describing, because she had lived in its borders. "Quiet gets exhausting," she said. Colt looked up. For one unguarded second, his eyes were not hard, not bright with menace or performance. They were the eyes of a boy sitting in a dark kitchen, listening for footsteps, folding foil into squares because order was the only power he had. Then the mask returned. He pushed back from the table, left his plate, and walked into the rain without closing the door behind him. Stood in the open doorway and watched his silhouette dissolve into the dark. Cold air poured across her bare arms. Behind her, the kitchen light threw a yellow rectangle onto the wet porch boards, a small, warm shape reaching outward into nothing. She closed the door gently. She washed his plate. She folded the dish towel into a square and set it on the counter. And then she sat at the table alone, pressed her fingers to her temples, and allowed herself 5 seconds of trembling, because she had just seen with devastating precision the exact wound she carried reflected in a man she was supposed to fear. The same darkness. The same architecture of survival built by hands too small to have ever deserved the blueprint. Somewhere outside, the dog barked once and went silent. The rain thickened. And in her narrow room, tucked inside the pocket of her suitcase where no one would think to look, a letter sat waiting, postmarked from a county courthouse 3 states east, carrying words that would, by morning, threaten to unravel every fragile thread she had begun to weave. Found the letter at Dawn's. She read it standing in the pale gray light of her small room, the paper trembling between her fingers like something alive and venomous. Her ex-husband's attorney had filed a restraining order against her, claiming she was unstable, erratic, a danger to her own daughter. The words swam beneath her eyes, each one a calculated lie dressed in legal language, each one designed to do what had always done best, make her disappear from the inside out. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, her suitcase was on the bed. She moved quietly, folding clothes with the mechanical precision of a woman who had packed in panic before, who knew exactly how to compress a life into 40 inches of zippered fabric. She would not bring this storm to store. She would not let these men, who had only just begun to sit at a table without flinching, become collateral in a war she had been losing for years. She would drive until the gas ran out and start again, somewhere smaller, somewhere couldn't reach. She almost made it. Was standing on the porch when she came through the kitchen door, suitcase in hand. He looked at her, then at the bag, and his weathered face did something it rarely did: it broke. Not dramatically. Just a quiet fracturing around the eyes, the kind of grief that belongs to a man who has watched too many good things walk away from him. "You're not the problem here," he said. "I'm not your problem to carry either," she whispered. Stepped down from the porch. He took the suitcase from her hand, gently, the way you take a sharp object from a child, and set it on the ground between them. "This ranch has survived drought, fire, and 30 years of my stubbornness," he said. "It can survive one more bully who hides behind a courthouse." He called a lawyer in Billings that afternoon. A woman named who spoke in calm, surgical sentences and asked questions no one had ever bothered to ask before, not what had done, but what had survived. The distinction cracked something open in his chest that she didn't know had been sealed shut. The Cowboys, in their own quiet language. Hector offered to write a statement, drove to town for supplies and came back with groceries, printer paper, and a tight-lipped fury that made his hands shake on the steering wheel. Even the town, cautious, watchful Alder Creek began to lean in. The postmistress offered her notary stamp. The feed store owner's wife brought a casserole and squeezed his hand without a word, which said everything. But it was Colt who shattered the silence no one expected him to break. He vanished for 2 days. No word, no note. Assumed he'd finally done what everyone always predicted, cut loose, drifted, returned to the rootless circuit of rodeos and bar fights that had shaped him. Hector shook his head sadly, said nothing. On the third morning, Colt's truck rolled up the drive. He walked into the kitchen carrying a cardboard box, water-stained, soft at the corners, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. He set it on the table where was sitting with paperwork spread before her. His face was drawn, pale beneath the sunburn, and his hands, those hands that had shattered plates and driven good people away, were shaking. "I kept these since I was 9, he said. His voice was barely audible. "Police reports, photographs, hospital discharge papers, my mother's," he swallowed. "I don't know if they help your case, but somebody should know that men like him don't get to keep winning." Looked at the box. She looked at Colt. And for the first time since she had arrived at this ranch, her composure dissolved completely, not into weakness, but into the raw, unguarded recognition of one survivor seeing another across the wreckage and understanding that they had been fighting the same war on different fronts. Used everything, the testimony, the records, the pattern, 2 men, 2 states, the same architecture of control. The attorney, confronted with the weight of it, folded quietly. No courtroom, no spectacle, just a phone call on a Thursday afternoon, sitting on the kitchen steps with the autumn sun on her face, hearing the words she had stopped believing she would ever hear.
It's done, he.
She didn't cheer. She pressed the phone against her chest and breathed one long, shuddering breath that seemed to begin somewhere deeper than her lungs, somewhere locked and airless that had finally, after years, been opened. That evening the men ate together, all of them. Colt sat at the table, not at the far end, not with his back to the wall, but beside Hector, across from, in the center of something he had spent his whole life convincing himself he didn't deserve. Called her daughter that night. The girl's voice was small, guarded, wrapped in the careful silence of a child who had learned not to hope too loudly. They spoke for 4 minutes. It was not a reunion. It was a first breath. Outside, the Montana sky opened wide and endless above the ranch, bruised with sunset, trembling with the first pale stars. Stood on the porch with Flower still dusting her hands and watched the horses graze in the low golden light, and she understood quietly, completely, that she had not come here to disappear.
She had come here to be found.
And sometimes courage isn't a roar. Sometimes it's a plate left on a counter in the dark, a box carried across years of silence, a woman who simply refused to leave. If this story reached something inside you, tell me where you're watching from, because somewhere out there, someone is still folding foil into squares, still listening for footsteps, still waiting for a door to open into warmth. Your kindness might be that door. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.